I recently sold all my Brain Bombs and Billy Bayo records. I was like, this spoke to me 10 years ago in my 20s, but I just don't know if I need this in my life anymore.
Yeah, I haven't put on. I still think that shit's amazing, but I don't know that I need to own it anymore, which is that's
I guess this is growing up.
Well, I guess this is growing.
Welcome to I'd Buy That for $1, a podcast about inexpensive, common, and underappreciated records that are waiting to be rediscovered. I'm your host, Sean Hartman, and I can't believe I was in a noise band for years and never once told anyone we sounded like Chicago, minus the horns and the rock and roll.
That's how I described Forget the Times to everyone for years.
I can't believe I didn't pick up on it. I'm going to have to reform the group just so I can describe us like that.
You'll have to freeform the group.
Ooh. Well, I'm co-host Jeremy, and I am the head of the committee to just sell the dang White Sox. You don't need two baseball teams in Chicago. Everybody likes the Cubs. Nobody likes the White Sox. Just sell them to some other city.
Whoa, I just felt...
Just the facts over here.
I felt a quarter of our listenership drop with that comment.
Unsubscribe.
Well, I am co-host Peter Cook, but a number of years ago at a former job when I was working at a home improvement store, in the break room, our lockers had our first name as well as the first letter, the initial of our last name on them. So mine said Peter C. And one of my coworkers named Belko liked to name off the celebrity names that they looked like. One was Sharon T. So of course she was Sharon Tate. And I was Peter Cetera.
Oh.
So that's
from Chicago.
From Chicago. Yes.
You had dorky coworkers.
Yeah, I fit right in there. And we have a special guest who is here.
I am here. And my name is Lance. Lance Barresi, owner of Permanent Records, the Permanent Records Roadhouse, curator of Brown Acid, and loyal fan of the Chicago White Sox.
Oh, no.
So I felt a quarter.
Just kidding.
Oh, I was going to say maybe it was a quarter of the co-hosts that I felt drop with that comment.
Just kidding. I will say, though, as a former Chicago resident, the White Sox are the working man team. The Cubs are more of the elitist kind of, let's just leave it at elitist, mainstream baseball team in Chicago.
I didn't know that divide.
Would you say that the White Sox are the most underappreciated team?
Exactly. They are the most I'd buy that for $1 baseball team in Chicago.
All right.
Interesting.
The committee's voting to just sell the dang Cubs then.
There you go. Now we're talking.
Flip-flop.
You can get a better price for them anyways.
It's true.
Parking's a lot easier on the south side, too.
Well, Lance, thank you so much for joining us. You reached out to us as wanting to guest, and this was what record did you want to come on to the program and talk to us about?
Well, of course, as an ex-Chicago resident, I had to choose the very underrated, extremely inexpensive, and pretty much all the way through double LP debut by Chicago, aka Chicago Transit Authority.
Yes.
Great. And what song would you like to reintroduce the people to Chicago with?
I think we should start off the podcast by reintroducing everybody to their 7-minute and 40-second, well, some of their 7-minute and 40-second cover of the Spencer Davis Group song, I'm a Man.
Excellent. And not even the longest song on the album.
Nope. Almost half as long as the longest song on this double LP.
Well, as this is a double LP, this is side C, track 3. That feels weird to even say. I don't like it.
I know we have not featured many double LPs on the podcast. This might be only the second. We did Donna Summer's Bad Girls way back towards the beginning. So I don't think we were even saying the side and the track name at that point. So let's get into it.
Right on.
I have to think that at least a few of our listeners out there might be more familiar with the 80s version of Chicago and may not have been expecting to hear what they just heard coming out of their speakers. Yeah, there's a long, diverse history with the sound of this band.
Yeah, this is a band that I avoided looking much into for many years because I grew up on classic rock radio as a kid and had heard all the hits over and over, including a bunch of the 80s songs that I'm not a big fan of still. But going back to this record after Lance was like, we got to talk about this Chicago Transit Authority. And I was like, I wonder why. And then I listened to it and was blown away. It's experimental. It's like rocking. It's well put together and sophisticated.
It's soulful.
Yeah. Insane horn work going on. And the thing I had zero recollection of is the insane guitar work going on as well.
Yeah, the Terry Kath era of Chicago is, almost as different from the later era stuff as the Syd Barrett era Pink Floyd is from Dark Side of the Moon or even later into that catalog. It's almost like two different bands.
Yeah, that's a good comparison as far as just complete shifts.
Yeah. And it practically is two different bands by like the mid 80s.
Definitely.
Sean Dad, are you a big time Chicago fan over there?
Not really. For a long time, I couldn't even tell you what songs were Chicago. And a few years back, one of my roommates was like, "No, dude, Chicago's good." And he played me a bunch of stuff. Some of which like I remembered but didn't realize it was Chicago, and some of which I was very pleasantly surprised how cool it was. But I still have not done like a deep dive in Chicago. I don't own any of their records. I've always known as a record seller that this is like the most valuable of the Chicago records, meaning it's worth like 5 to 10 instead of like 1 to 2.
I remember having a lot of the early albums, multiple copies sitting around at Corner Record Shop when you and I were working there, Sean.
Yeah, there's all the records up in the bin and then the box or two full of them underneath, I'm sure a lot of record stores have similar Chicago collections sitting around. But yeah, so I've known for a while that this is a group that has more stuff than people give them credit for, but I just I didn't dive in yet. The other thing that made me realize Chicago was legit was when I found out how often they would tour with Earth, Wind & Fire. And any group that gets the regular Earth, Wind & Fire seal of approval, then I'm behind it.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that in the 2000s, throughout various years, they were doing tours where they were like combining the bands on stage.
Yeah, that's what I'd heard.
Pretty epic.
I was just going to say, when a band has existed or exists as long as Chicago did and still does, and the catalog is, 30 odd records of studio albums, it's very hard. It's very overwhelming, I guess I should say, to try to dip your toe into those waters. You don't know where to begin. So I don't blame people for not even trying, especially if you've heard some of the hits on the radio. But one of my favorite things to do is when I do feel like a band's catalog is overwhelming and I don't know where to begin, I almost always just go straight to the first album. I think that's like a pretty good rule of thumb, and it almost always yields the most interesting results, even if you do end up getting into a later album, down the line, even more than the first one. It at least kind of gives you an idea of where that band started, and then you can figure out kind of how different they are from what you thought they might actually be, and then take it from there.
Mm-hmm. The same is true for Jimmy Buffett. He's got a good first record.
Totally.
No one would ever expect it.
I was just listening to the first G.G. Allin album before we got on here today, actually, which is a very, very different sound than anything else that he did after the fact. It's David Peel produced. It's kind of almost power poppy. It's not terribly offensive.
Yeah, it's musical.
It's melodic.
His singing voice is still actually there on that early stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're talking about Chicago, Jeremy. Sorry to get off on a G.G. Allin tangent.
Yeah, wow.
Well, I was just going to say, this might be the first time that Chicago, Jimmy Buffett, and G.G. Allin were ever talked about within the same minute.
Yeah, the only maybe on the best show.
That's good company there for sure.
Well, one thing I wanted to throw out there, I think this is a band that just did not cross like a generation gap. I feel like to our listeners who are like maybe late Gen X or older, it might seem absurd to put Chicago as, an underappreciated, unknown band. They sold over 100 million records in their time.
Yeah.
But I know, like, millennials and younger, none of us are listening to Chicago, by and large.
True.
Although I have heard word, this hasn't necessarily been my experience, but on Chicago 13, there's a track called Street Player that apparently younger people are stoked on, probably more than they are even on this first album.
Weird.
So,
that would have been like disco era.
Yeah, and 1979, and that one has an $11 median on Discogs, so you can't even feature it properly on the podcast, guys. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, a few years ago, "You're My Inspiration" was used in a pretty prominent scene in Deadpool, so I think that some of the younger generation might have latched onto that song.
Yeah, all the Deadpool fans.
Didn't help me sell any more Chicago records at the store, unfortunately.
You've kind of got into this, but what inspired you to bring this record?
A few different things, but let me start by saying that I think the concept of this podcast is really great. I'm a huge fan of championing the underdog. So always, since we started the store in Chicago in 2006, I've been digging for, kind of unsung heroes in the bins, and like y'all did at Corner, putting little notes on the records that are by artists that maybe people have a certain idea about but don't sound like what they think they sound like, etc. And kind of guiding people towards things that are more interesting than they may expect them to be. And this was one early on for me. I don't remember when I was exposed to this first, but I was certainly not. I wouldn't have called myself a Chicago fan, wouldn't have touched this record with a 10-foot pole based on having heard Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is?
Which is on this album.
Oh,
yeah.
It is. It's very much on this album. And actually, hearing that song for the first time with the kind of slightly discordant piano intro also put it in a little bit different of context for me mentally. It really kind of pointed out that what you hear on the radio isn't necessarily always what you get on an album, which is what it is. But it also kind of stoked me out to know that Chicago would get weird. And even on what was definitely the biggest hit on this album, they weren't afraid to experiment and try kind of really far out there things. So, hearing that and then digging deeper into the album, you finally do eventually come across what are very experimental elements. My history in Chicago, my love of hard rock, which there are a little touches of on this album. There's definitely fuzz guitar and just incredible guitar work all over the place. And just this whole album is just like super funky, groovy to say the least. And it kind of just checks all the boxes. If you can have, I would say it appeals to a wide variety of people. And I think it's great all the way through, which is another thing that I think is important when you're recommending something to other people, not to just pick records that have one banger, like I think y'all featured Village People Renaissance, like I love Food Fight. I think that song's awesome. Most of side B is great, but most of side A is not. And some of side B isn't nearly as great as Food Fight. It's really all about that song for me anyway.
Yeah, it's true.
Meeting your criteria of $5 and under with an album that I think is listenable all the way through and pretty great for the majority of the listen was important when choosing.
It was former guest of the show, Stephen Plastic Crime Wave Krakow, who recommended this to me a few years ago, and I believe the next selection that we wanted to feature is what he was like, that's what you got to hear, the free form guitar track.
Yeah, let's give it to the people. It feels like the right time.
Yeah. So
yeah, I think going into this one without knowing exactly what to expect is really what's up.
All right. Yeah. Let's say no more. Side C, track 1. Yeah, it does feel weird, Jeremy. Those were the sounds of original Chicago guitarist Terry Kath, who we briefly mentioned before, but just to be clear, that is who was on the guitar there.
Just, casually inventing noise music in the middle of a Chicago their first LP as a band. There was a double LP that included that.
Yeah, that's how they start the second record.
Yeah, and that goes for almost 7 minutes.
On Columbia in 1969.
Yes, a very major label. If you heard Hendrix vibes on that, you wouldn't be far off. And maybe you already know this, maybe you don't, but Jimi Hendrix has been quoted as saying, "You guys are motherfuckers. Terry Kath's a better guitar player than I am." And he wanted to produce the band at some point, and unfortunately that never came to be due to some untimely passings. But Hendrix complimented Terry Kath's playing and saw him as an innovator, and he was impressed with his playing, which I don't think happened very often.
Yeah, Terry Kath is an unsung hero of guitar innovation, I'd say.
For sure. And in the documentary, the Terry Kath documentary that his daughter made, music critic William Rollman said, "Had Kath's group been a power trio called something like the Terry Kath Experience that showcased his playing, there's little doubt he would rank among the guitar heroes of the 1970s.
For sure.
Instead, he's buried in a 7-piece band called Chicago. 6 or 7-piece band.
Well, let me give a rundown of Chicago. I'm obviously not going to get deep in the weeds because this band has like a 50-year career spanning 38 albums. So we're just going to do the best we can here.
Yeah, we are just at album 1 here on this episode.
Yep. So I'm not even going to start with any of the players where they were born or anything. There are too many of them with too many stories. We're going to start at the birth of the band itself, called The Big Thing in Chicago. And they formed in 1967. And they started up as a cover band playing top 40 hits in the Chicago nightclubs. Chicago started as they wanted to be a rock and roll band with horns, which goes against the grain of the Beatles era, 2 guitars and a bass and drums. So they tried to go that direction, and they succeeded beyond anyone's wildest imagination, but we'll get there. I was intrigued to find that it was, in fact, in Niles, Michigan, not too far from where Peter and I stand, that an old friend of the sax player, Walter Parazader, and also trombone player for Chicago, he ran into an old friend of his, Jimmy Guercio, who happened to be a CBS Records producer.
In Niles, Michigan.
Michigan.
Well, I thought the only musical thing that had come out of there was Tommy James and the Shondells, but...
No, this is where Chicago caught their big break, essentially, because he loved it, and CBS Records did not love it at first. The band moves out to L.A. at Jimmy Guercio's urging, and he keeps trying to push the band to CBS Records. They're like, we kind of have this other horn rock band called Blood, Sweat, and Tears.
Yeah. Weak.
And we don't want 2 horn bands. So he saved Jimmy Guercio ended up producing Blood, Sweat, and Tears' next album and used money from producing it to help Chicago record some demos that got them some buzz that got CBS Records to relent and finally agree to sign them.
Wow.
Whatever it takes.
When you were talking about the whole rock bands with horns, first thing that came to mind that was going on around that same time was Blood, Sweat, and Tears, but I had no idea that there was that close of a tie.
Oh, yeah. Yep. So it's at this time they've moved to LA and they're playing the clubs around LA. They they were playing pretty regularly at the Whiskey a Go-Go, a pretty famous club out there, and were opening for Janis Joplin and the previously mentioned Jimi Hendrix, where he likely would have said that quote.
They were also playing a lot with James Gang in the early days, which, I think most people don't associate James Gang in Chicago, but once you've heard that for this first Chicago album, it totally makes sense.
Yeah, and that early playing in James Gang by Joe Walsh was some pretty gnarly stuff too.
No doubt.
Guitar playing, yeah.
Yeah, so then they go on. It's time to record their first album. They're signed, and they want to record this behemoth double album. CBS Records does not want them to record a double album. So they tell them that, if you guys really want to do a double album, we're going to take like a bigger cut of the royalties. So they took a pay cut to be able to go forward and do this double album that, that's like unheard of. You don't debut your band with a double album. I can't even think of another example of a band doing that.
Frank Zappa, Mothers of Invention.
Freak Out.
Yeah, there's not many others.
Yeah.
And they were Chicago Transit Authority at this point, correct?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so when they moved to LA, they changed the name to Chicago Transit Authority from The Big Thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then after this album, had to shorten it to Chicago because the actual Chicago Transit Authority was threatening to sue them.
Wow.
Yes. In the liner notes of the album, I won't read the whole thing, but it starts by saying the name of this endeavor is simply, quote, the Chicago Transit Authority, and then goes on to say, the printed word can never aspire to document a truly musical experience. So if you must call them something, speak of the city where that all save one were born, where all of them were schooled and bred, where all of this incredible music went down barely noticed. Call them Chicago.
Oh, so it says that in there.
There's other great liner notes. Also, one producer's note for Freeform Guitar says Freeform Guitar was performed on a Fender Stratocaster guitar through a Showman amplifier equipped with a twin 15 bottom utilizing a Bogan PA amplifier as a preamp. No electronic gimmicks or effects were used in the recording of this selection, the intent being to capture as faithfully as possible the actual sound of the performance as it occurred. And that's for Terry Kath just making noise with feedback.
Far out.
Love it.
So avant-garde.
Very avant-garde.
And that, I would say that the first liner note you read keeps, that captures their image, which was just albums and albums of just the band name Chicago. And it's like little logo script, and they would just name the albums, Chicago 2, Chicago 3, Chicago 4 down the line, because they didn't think their music could be represented any certain way. So they didn't see any point in like naming an album a certain thing for quite some time.
Right up until 1978's Hot Streets.
True.
Finally, they'd found other words to describe their sound.
You break that long streak for the epic album title, Hot Streets.
Yeah. Chicago 11 made sense, but Chicago 12 just seemed played out,
Too far.
There actually is pretty good reason for that, but we'll get there.
Okay, cool.
I can't wait to find that.
Another crazy thing about this album is the record label limited Chicago to 5 days in the studio of tracking and 5 days of overdubbing. So
Whoa.
This whole double album was recorded in 10 days.
That is
incredible.
no time.
Yeah, with a 7-piece band with all those horns, like that's just wild. And this was the first time any of the band members had been in a real studio recording an album like this. So they're also going in on this crazy short time frame with no experience working in the studio.
Maybe that's how they wrote the lyrics to the song, Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is?
It could be.
Very confused after epic sessions in the studio for 10 straight days, knocking out this massive double LP. This thing is dense, too. There's a lot going on.
I was gonna say the track "Freeform Guitar" suddenly makes sense when you imagine these guys on like probably multiple days of no sleep trying to knock this out in the studio.
No doubt.
Yeah, so this album actually doesn't sell super well at first, but starts getting a little bit of airplay, and it's actually during Chicago 2, which was actually just called Chicago when it was released, that they actually started getting some airplay and catching on, and the record label decided to put out singles from the first album instead of continuing to push what was on the second album, that this album finally got some traction. Which I'll also note, Chicago 2 was also a double album, as well as the album after it, also a double album. And all of them went on to be platinum selling albums.
Yeah, that I believe is unprecedented. I can't think of a single artist that's ever come out the gate with, you said 3 double albums
3 double
in
albums,
a row.
followed by a live quadruple album for their 4th. And then on their 5th album was their first regular LP, like single album.
Yeah. And don't forget, that's all in 3 back-to-back years, too. 69, 70, and 71. 3 double LPs. Unbelievable.
Yeah, so they are getting famous through the 70s, just album after album, platinum hits, like #1 records. They are cruising. I was reading at their live shows, they would set up a fake phone booth that they called the Snortatorium, where the band members would go in to do cocaine in the middle of their live shows. So they were partying it up, on top of the world. Everything's going great. Just hit after hit after hit through the 70s. Then we hit some tragedy. Do you want to tell them about the tragedy, Lance? Or
Sure, yeah, I'll chime in. So unfortunately, in 1978, tragedy struck Chicago when their lead guitar player, Terry Kath, was at his home in, I forget where, but in rural America somewhere. He was an avid gun collector and hunter, etc. He had a little to drink. He was a little, tore up. He had a gun out. He was cleaning it. He thought the gun was empty. He emptied the clip, put the clip back in. Unbeknownst to him, there was 1 bullet left in the chamber. He said to his friend, who was a little concerned, maybe even Peter Cetera, one of the other Chicago band members, I think, was the witness, says to his friend, "Don't freak out, man. It's empty. Look." The last words that came out of his mouth were, "It's not loaded." And the gun went off, and Terry died instantly.
yeah, so that's a wild story to me. Robert Lamb, the keyboard player, claims that Terry had been up for days at that point on a binge, and was probably just not thinking clearly. Everyone around him insisted that he wasn't suicidal in any way, and that this was definitely just an accident. Yeah, and kind of corroborates that same story that he was just playing with guns and
Just being a little reckless.
reckless, and his last words just being like, what you said there. That's wow.
Yeah, heavy. And such a tragedy. He was married, had at least 1 child at the time. He was the leader of the band. He was the superstar of Chicago at that time. Everybody talks about Peter Cetera in Chicago now, but during those days, it was all about Terry Kath. Everybody knew it. like we said, even Jimi Hendrix was impressed with his playing. He was knocking people's socks off. And the world of rock music lost a superstar when Terry Kath accidentally shot himself.
Yeah. Let's play another song. Do you want to do some Southern California Purples next?
Yeah. Speaking of Hendrix, this one I think is, aside from the feedback on freeform guitar, maybe the most overtly Hendrixy of all the tracks on this album. It's a banger, straight out of the gate.
So we're talking a little side C track 2.
Once again, I think we need to double back on those horns going on there.
Yeah, it's like, what if Jimi Hendrix had a horn section?
Yeah, that was like blues rocky and just grinding, but those horns are really kind of what makes Chicago. I gotta say it.
It's brand.
On brand, no doubt. Love it or hate it. That's what you get with Chicago. And I don't blindly follow anybody's lead as far as like disliking a certain genre of music if it's got this on it or that on it. Good music's good music, and that's kind of the moral of the story.
I really like on some of the other selections that we're not featuring on this album. I know we're relegating ourselves to the side C, the side 3 cuts here, but on some of the more pop oriented tracks, there's still these weird, almost like chimey, dissonant. They sound like dissonant bells, the horns, the way they're arranged. They kind of come in eerie almost at times. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, the harmonies between the horns and some of the parts, they do a great job of building tension with that dissonance.
Yeah.
Where they're kind of like a little bit off and then they come together. And
Yeah, and the cut we were just listening to, some of the swells,
Mhm.
the horn section swells, even the intervals of the notes that they're choosing.
Yeah. If you don't like it, it's because you don't like horns. It's not because these guys are amazing at what they're doing. It's wild how tight they are all together.
Yeah, I'd say them and the Earth, Wind, and Fire horn sections are, top notch, top of the game.
No doubt. And the horns are on here, and they're used to I think it's really tasteful the way that they use them, and it's, in my opinion, not off-putting in a way that I think, some other rock records that have horns on them can be. So yeah, that anytime somebody says horns don't belong in rock music, I'll point to this album or the Manfred Mann Chapter 3 album just to prove people wrong, because it's very perfectly done on both of these records.
Well, let me wrap up the last 40 years of Chicago in the next couple minutes here.
Good luck.
So, yeah, after Terry Kath's passing, the band is considering just breaking up, calling it quits. They decide not to, and decide to go forth with their 12th album, Hot Streets, which is, I mean, it's a big change for the band, with Terry Kath being out, and they are also moving into, I mean, it's disco. Like, it sounds like a disco album, or at least at minimum Chicago trying to do a disco album. And yeah, they go that direction for a couple albums before they kind of backpedal as new wave becomes popular, and they start to strip it back down. And that's when they hit this long run of just super selling records that are primarily ballads.
Yeah, power ballads.
Power ballads, extremely 80s sounding. The guitar going on in it sounds closer to hair metal, I would say.
Yeah, they sound like hair metal power ballads.
Yeah. So
adult contemporary.
Yeah, maybe
hard pass.
Yeah.
Hardest pass.
That's my favorite Chicago stuff.
Said no one ever, and actually everyone. That's most people's favorite Chicago stuff.
Yeah. Yeah,
not record collector snobs like ourselves, guys, like mainstream.
Normal
like the people that are going to see Chicago concerts on a regular basis.
At Wrigley Field, not whatever the stadium's called where the White Sox play. That's where I go see Chicago.
Yeah, they don't even name the White Sox stadium, I'm pretty sure. So working class.
Do not fact check us on that.
Do not. Yeah, so they're cranking out hits through the 80s. Come the 90s, they start to lose some momentum as, music's changing quite a bit around this time. They do have an interesting, for their album 22, which was called Stone of Sisyphus, they decided to try and get like a little more experimental again, and they sort of updated their sound again. And there was like, I went and found this album because reading about it intrigued me, and there's almost some like boom bap or boom bap influence going on, and like 90s computery sounds, and it definitely feels inspired, I would say.
Well, the name of the album alone makes me feel like they're trying to say that they're, despite everything working against them, they're going to push that boulder back up that hill and succeed yet again.
And the record label was like, nope. And they shelved the record, and it was one of those lost records for about 15 years. Until it comes out as Chicago 32 in 2008. So that is out there to hear now. It's an interesting listen. I don't think I liked it, but it was definitely inspired and interesting.
I'll have to check that one out.
But still waiting for the record store day reissue of that one, right?
Yeah.
Only CD so far. It's ready.
Yeah, and they have continued putting stuff out. I should mention Peter Cetera, who kind of became the front man after Terry Kath passed. He left the band in 1985 to pursue a solo career, and they've kind of just been churning members through the decades as they've continued recording and performing. Currently, the keyboard player Robert Lamb from the original band still plays with them. Lee Loughnane, the trumpet player, and James Pankow, the trombone player. They are the three original members still playing with Chicago. They've kind of had a rotating cast since the mid-'80s, I would say. But they're still recording. They put out an album in 2022, Chicago 38.
Why not?
So they're
Born for this moment.
Yeah, they're still doing it.
Just not as well, unfortunately, as this classic 1969 album.
Yeah.
It'd be amazing if they put something like Freeform Guitar on one of their post-1980 albums.
Yeah. It wouldn't mean the same thing nowadays, though.
No, not at all.
Everyone would then think they're just ripping off Wolf Eyes.
I was going to say they should do like one of those classic artist albums where they just collaborate with people, but it's all like noise artists collaborating with them.
Chicago and the Dead Sea.
That's what the people really want. That's what the true Chicago heads are looking for.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what, Lou Reed collaborated with Metallica, right? Why the hell not?
Yeah,
True.
opened up so many doors
Yeah.
with the way that album was received.
Yeah. Maybe that'll be in an episode of I'd Buy That for $1 40 years from now.
Lulu.
Lulu.
I think that it could be. But Sean, don't you know someone that has the take on it that's a great album that no one got?
Yeah, Jeremy Ruggles.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I was going to say, I do know that person. It's me.
Yeah, you have two Lulu defenders here.
But I also, former guest of the show, Dustin Krasanovich, I believe, made his own custom trucker hat that says Lulu is a good album.
That's what I was thinking of. Yeah. He who came on to talk to us about Bob James' Touchdown.
Yes.
Maybe Scott Walker and Son collaborating is a better comparison.
True. Does make sense.
Sean, I'm curious what you found for recommended similar albums to this.
All right, I got 4 albums that have a few parallels to this one. First is the band that we've mentioned several times, Earth, Wind, and Fire. If you dig into their earlier stuff, it gets more psychedelic. My pick is self-titled from 1971. Here's some of the comparisons of the funk, but also is getting weird at times. Next up is the great Philadelphia rock soul crossover band Soul Survivors. Not a dollar record, but their second album, Take Another Look from 1969, again, is a really good comparison of that crossover of the like heavier guitar work and psych rock and the soul influenced arrangements. Next up, Daryl Hall and John Oates' War Babies from 1974, the Todd Rundgren produced album that, again, you got the soul influence, you got the pop rock in there. Thought there were some interesting comparisons. And then last up, a record that we featured before, Herbie Mann's Memphis Underground from 69. A record that is mostly pop except for a couple way out there free-form guitar moments.
And I found one at the flea market this morning.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Lance, you mentioned Manfred Mann's Chapter 3, which isn't necessarily a cheap record, but it's one that sounds like it could be a recommended similar album.
Absolutely. Came out in the same year as the first Chicago album. It's got a similar vibe, but I think it's actually even cooler than this album, but it's laden with horns, just done super tastefully in a way that not a lot of rock bands incorporated them. It's a stunning record, and it does get underpriced often because people just assume it's the Manfred Mann of the mid 60s and not 1969 Manfred Mann.
Do-wah diddy.
Do-wah diddy. Diddy dum, diddy do.
I will also throw out there Bread, the album we featured with Steve Krakow, who was mentioned earlier in this episode.
On the Waters.
Yeah, just the way that, in my mind, Chicago was kind of an adult contemporary thing. I had similar feelings about Bread, and then we dug into some of the older stuff, and There's some interesting far out things going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say closet. I'm not a closet fan of anything. I wear everything on my sleeve that I dig. I have no guilty pleasures. But I was stoked that Steve, who's an old friend of mine, Chicago guy, obviously chose Bread, because I'm an unabashed proponent of Bread, especially the early shit. That song Guitar Man from the album of the same name is outstanding.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Also a cheap record.
Yeah.
Very cheap.
Well, Lance, while you're here with us, would you like to promote anything that you're up to?
I love doing shameless self-promotion. Yeah, absolutely. As I said earlier, I'm the owner of Permanent Records and the Permanent Records Roadhouse, which is a live music venue, a bar, and a record store all under one roof in Los Angeles, California. I'm also the curator of the Brown Acid compilation series, where I comp hard rock, heavy psych, and proto metal 45s, mostly expensive ones, unfortunately, on vinyl, CD, and digitally with the help of a label called Writing Easy Records. And we do a record label ourselves called Permanent Records out here in LA as well. We've reissued a bunch of cool things and done new records or more contemporary records by newer bands as well.
Yeah, and people can see the records you have at Permanent Records on Instagram. Peter and I watch that at Permanent Records Roadhouse. Can see you flipping through those new stacks as they come in. And you curate another compilation called Scrap Metal.
Yeah.
Of heavy metal, obscure heavy metal 45s.
Yeah, most of that stuff keeps me busy 24/7. So,
the third selection that we featured, that heavy Hendrix sounding one, I don't think I've ever actually heard this artist, Captain Foam. Have you ever heard of that, Lance?
Yeah, I comped that on Brown Acid, actually.
Okay, see, that sounds like, I was like thinking maybe I knew that in the back of my head, but that's like when you said that, that's the first artist that came to mind. And there was this old photo I saw of Captain Foam, and I don't think I ever actually heard Captain Foam, but it was just like a wall of amplifiers behind this guitarist that I assume was yeah, and that's what I imagined it sounded like. This is a blues heavy riffage over distorted. So that's cool. Yeah, maybe that was somewhere in the back of my head that was connected to Brown Acid.
Yeah, strip away the horns and you're not far off, but Captain Foam takes the heaviness level up like 11 notches. Yeah, that's a story for another time, but Captain Foam you can hear Captain Foam's track No Reason on one of the volumes of Brown Acid. There's 14 of them at this point. It's very hard for me to keep track of which songs are on which one. But if you like the Chicago vibe and you're looking for something like that on Brown Acid, the Canadian band Brothers in One have a song called Hard on Me that has horns on it. And there's a psychedelic rock band called Stone Garden that incorporated horns in their music. Their song Oceans Inside Me, also on Brown Acid, not far off from what we've heard on the Chicago album.
And not far from what you're about to hear as we take off here.
Yeah, I heard that we're going to liberate ourselves from side C with a little liberation, which is on side D, side 4 of this record.
Yeah, and is like 12 or 17 minutes or something.
Yeah, 15 minutes and 41 seconds. And one of the most phenomenal parts about this song is that it was recorded entirely live, completely uncut as it was recorded in the studio in the 5 days that they had to record the whole double LP. Just, listen or keep that in mind when listening to this song next time.
Yeah, this is the final track on this colossal album, and you requested that we started about a minute and a half into the track when I think Terry starts to really do his thing.
Yes, we want to feature Terry Kath as much as possible, and also, some of the songs on this album, poem number 58, is another example of this, where it starts off in your more kind of, does anybody really know what time it is style, and then the band really just kind of goes to a different place and goes a little bit further out than I think most people would expect out of a band called the band Chicago.
Wonderful. Well, Lance, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us here at I'd Buy That for $1. Listeners, next week is going to be the final episode of season 3.
Oh, thank goodness you said season 3. I was about to get a little upset. I thought you were going to stop after final episode.
Well, you've been our goal to get you on, and that was, once we did that, we were done.
Yep. Yeah, right. Anyway, guys, I do want to say thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor. I love the podcast. I appreciate the concept of it and all the hard work that goes into it. It is very much appreciated by me, and I'm sure many, many other listeners. Please keep up the good work. We love it.
Aw. This is the part of the show where I blush.
Yeah.
You haven't been blushing this whole time, Jeremy?
I can't. That's an hour. I can't blush for an hour. It just becomes who you are at that point.
Resting blush face.
Resting blush face. Oh, let's call it there.
Yeah, sounds good.
Right
Well, this has been I'd Buy That for $1. My name is Peter Cook.
I'm Jeremy Ruggles.
I'm Sean Hartman.
I'm Lance Barresi.